So, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome, or good morning. It depends which part of the world you're in. It's afternoon for me. A very warm welcome to this WRI webinar on country platforms. We've got a really exciting lineup of speakers as we aim to discuss how country platforms can drive green growth in developing countries. And there's, I think as many of you have been picking up, an enormous amount of discussion going on in a whole range of international events around country platforms. There's some quite widely differing interpretations of what they mean. So we aim to try and demystify the term in this webinar. And explain where it comes from, and also look at some practical examples of where it has been applied. And as you listen to our panelists, we aim to highlight some of the issues that need to be addressed if we want to take a new cohort of country platforms forward. So, yeah, this is a webinar. The format is going to be, we're going to have a brief welcome from Melanie. I'll introduce her just now. And then we've got a group of widely acknowledged experts in the field. And these are people that have been at the cutting edge of developing the concept, of applying it in the real world. And we're going to hear from each of them. So I'm going to do it in a panel discussion format. I want to try and keep this conversational, so we're not going to have any long speeches or inputs or presentations. And I do want to ask you as the audience to participate in this through the Q&A. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I want to invite you, as people are presenting, to pose your questions. And we will, during the course of the webinar, I'm going to encourage the panelists to respond directly to your questions. I might not be able to take all of them, but we'll highlight some of the main ones and get proper responses for you. So that's the format that we're going to follow. But I want to kick us off with a little video clip. And the video comes from earlier this year. So in February, the South African government convened an exchange between developing countries that are actively developing platforms or in the process of thinking about it. And it was a start of what we hope is going to evolve into a South-South exchange network, so that we can, as we develop these platforms, share experiences between countries. And during the conference, we had a comms team who have produced this short video drawn from interviews, and we're going to play this next. So over to you, comms team.
A country platform is a developmental approach that both supports people and climate.
And they really matter because they have the potential to really drive that transition to green growth.
The country platform is a way for a country to take its national programs and ask the question, how best can I finance this program?
Take all the pieces of puzzles that are available, but just repurpose them for what is required by the country at this point.
The way we see it is a way of connecting large pools of capital around investment in a climate solution.
The countries are better able to market themselves to the international community, indicate what is important for them, and how the incoming investments will help them meet their objectives.
It's not just about money, it's also about policies and integrating, if you want, the policy with the investment part.
There is a renewal of the conversation on country platforms right now in order to make the instrument more efficient and well connected to the country's needs.
A country platform really needs to answer the needs of the country.
The country platform is not kind of one size fits all. You cannot just reproduce the country platform of Botswana or Zambia or Zimbabwe in another country.
There are commitments that have been made at the various at the various COPs in terms of funds and commitments for climate finance. Country platforms are a great instrument to actually find mechanisms to enable those funds to then flow.
That's the first time I've seen that video clip, and I must say, you all sound so eloquent. And you're going to see a number of the people on that clip live now as panelists in this conversation. So well done to the comms team. I think that was a remarkably good job of putting that together. So I'm going to turn to WRI's Global Director for Climate Economics and Finance, Melanie Robinson. Melanie's been driving a lot of this work in WRI, and I'm really looking forward to your remarks, Melanie, kicking us off in this conversation. Over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Crispian, and lovely to see so many friends and also new people here at this webinar. So yeah, Crispian and everyone here, I'm going to just say a bit about what is a country platform, how does it add value, and what moment we're in now, which will pick up on some of those threads you saw in that video. So what is a country platform? Well, there are various definitions. This is the one that I like. It's a structured mechanism for mobilizing diverse finance and driving systemic reforms to implement ambitious priority country-led climate, nature, and development goals. So that's the statement. Now let me just break that down a little bit more into the key elements. I want to start with the capital stack, because that's what people are really interested in this country platform. As we heard from Salim, how are we bringing diverse types of finance, domestic, international, public, private, together behind a country's priorities in a really efficient way and at scale, and in a way where you're making really catalytic use of those scarce concessional finance resources, of blended finance, of de-risking tools to really get the finance behind the plan. So that's the core of what we're trying to achieve. But there are some building blocks that go, if you like, above that to make that happen. And that's an investment program and an investable pipeline focused on the priority sectors and investments for the country. We all know how important an investable pipeline is to get the finance to flow. It's the policy and regulatory reforms that Josue just talked about, that we cannot get the finance flowing unless there's an enabling policy environment, and having well-timed and sequenced policy reforms are absolutely essential to the country platform. And then behind that still is the development and climate plans, and the idea that high ambition climate and nature goals are integrated into core development planning and backed by domestic resources. And finally, behind that is political leadership and public support. In our review of country platforms over the decades, strong political leadership was found to be one of the most important factors, and ODI has done some great work on how countries can ensure that there's a political settlement around that, underpinned by an institutional structure that can really drive forward the country platform and ensure transparent M&E. So those are the key elements. Now, why does it add value? I would say 4 things. Firstly, it takes a systematic approach. So this is now bringing climate and nature into the core of the whole of government, whole of economy, whole of society conversation. It's really integrating in that way, and it's bringing policy and finance together. Secondly, it's about scale. By bringing finance together in this way and making sure it's built on those strong foundations, you can really achieve leverage, and you can have that catalytic use of concessional finance and de-risking tools. Thirdly, efficiency. This is about finance working as a system and trying to overcome that fragmentation we see in the climate finance world and also increasingly in the development world, and reducing transaction costs, because financiers who come into this kind of system should be making agreement with each other that they'll use each other's systems and processes, that they're all going to be fully aligned behind the country plan, and really taking some of those old lessons we know, harmonization, alignment, coordination, and being more efficient. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, impact. The whole point of country platforms is that they can bring about transformational change in terms of the climate, nature, and development impacts that countries are looking for. Are these new? I referred back there to some of the history and the lessons from development. No. In many ways, back at the beginning of my career in the early 2000s, I had the pleasure to work in many countries in Africa on their development platforms. And these came out of the poverty reduction strategy processes, the HIPC process, and donors having multi-donor budget support, sector-wide approaches, and all donor support was coming in behind a country's own plan, using their own systems and processes, and a lot of commitments around how that finance was going to be harmonized and coordinated. That was the 2000s, but they got a new lease of life, and they came back in a different form, if you like, in 2001 with the JETPs, because this is for the first time when climate really came to the forefront, and these were the energy transitions. So they took that idea of a really programmatic sectoral approach that was really trying to look systematically at the sector and bring finance together, but behind energy. And something else that was new is that they were much more about mobilizing private finance, partly because of the way development finance had matured over the years, and partly because of the opportunities in energy to really drive forward the transition with private finance. And then step forward to 2003, and we started to see a broader range of country platforms come forward, and the term country platforms started to be used more. And here, these were platforms which looked not just at energy, but started to integrate climate, nature, and development, and look across sectors where resilience was important, where nature was important, whilst also sometimes looking at energy. And if you think about the JETP countries, that's South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal. And in recent years, we've seen Egypt, Bangladesh, North Macedonia, Brazil, Colombia, and Turkey come forward with country platforms. There may be others that I've missed. And now, as we come into 2025, we're in a moment when up to 50 countries are considering this approach. More countries from small island states, more lower income countries, more smaller economies, and a wider diversity of countries, of sectors that people are looking at. And so how have we got to now? Well, I talked about the JETP process. Actually, that was even preceded by work within the G20 and within the COP. We had, dating back to 2018, the period 2018 to 22, the G20 eminence persons, the country platform reference framework, the starting of the IH leg, the Sharm framework, through to 2023, where we saw the G20 independent expert group on MDBs talking about the country platforms and the high-level MDB statement. So momentum was building through those years, but I think has really built up as we came through to last year with Brazil's leadership in the G20, which led to the MDB roadmap, where country platforms came through very strongly, and the MDBs responded with a viewpoint note. And where we saw the NCQG, the new quantified quantitative goal, I got the acronym right there, where 300 billion at least was committed by 2035, but just as importantly, or more importantly, agreement to a roadmap to 1.3 trillion of external finance to help countries meet their climate goals, and a recognition that mobilization of public and private finance and bringing finance together at scale and in a more leveraged way is going to be essential for that. And then through this year, we've seen momentum building. We've just had the Ocean Summit. FFD is just coming up, Finance for Development. South Africa's G20 is taking this issue. Country platforms now have a track in the Coalition of Finance Ministers for climate action. And this will culminate all in COP30 in Brazil, where the Baku to Belém roadmap will certainly feature country platforms. I stand to be corrected by Brazilian colleagues here. And country platforms stand to be a really important part of that COP. So I'll just finish by saying, for countries that are thinking about country platforms, where do they go for support? And to mention that III is part of a wide network of support that's providing technical assistance, that's bringing countries together to share lessons as a community of practice, and to collaborate with each other, and also to point to the different support that is available, whether that's from GCF readiness funds or from support from MDBs or many other service providers. And in this group, there's a wide array of organizations, many of them represented here today. There are philanthropists, there are climate funds, development banks, service providers, and a very strong Southern representation in that group, a real emphasis on making sure that this is a Southern group of support organizations working with countries in the Global South who are interested in country platforms. So that's the context. Really looking forward to the panel today. I'll pass it back to you, Crispian.
Thank you, Mel. That was an excellent overview of the development of country platforms, and it sort of nicely tees up our next panelist because, I mean, you mentioned the succession of events and debates, the Eminent Persons Group, Brazil's G20 process last year. The person who's been tracking this issue through all those processes and has widely published on it and steered many of these complicated G20 discussions is Josue Tanaka. So it's a real privilege, Josue, to have you join us today. So Josue is a senior advisor at ODI and also with the LSE Grantham Research Institute. And Josue, if I could turn to you and say, you know, you've been with this concept as it's evolved over recent years, particularly in the G20. What shifts have you seen in the way that country platforms are designed and implemented? Yeah, how have you seen the concept evolve?
Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you all today to address a topic, as Melanie mentioned, I think with great expectations. And let's all hope, with great impact. So turning to your question, Crispian, on how country platforms, you know, have been covered in recent processes, Melanie already gave some view. Maybe I'll give a bit more detail on that for everyone. So clearly, the Brazilian presidency of the G20 last year definitely played a role in highlighting and putting forward, you know, the potential role of country platforms to scale up climate and development action. To be a bit granular, this was done at the level of the G20 in at least 3 different ways. One, through the task force CLIMA, in terms of positioning the role of country platforms in scaling up finance for climate action. Then it was done also through the International Financial Architecture Working Group. Melanie referred to that in terms of the MDB reform and the role that the MDBs can play in country platforms. And then finally, in a third stream, in the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, in terms of climate and environment funds and how country platforms can contribute to enhance their effectiveness and impact. So as a result of this work that was done during the G20, country platforms are now actually an important element in the context of the COP30, including as one of the 5 priorities for the COP30 Circle of Finance Ministers, and therefore as an important element in the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion. Now, Crispian, you asked me the question about evolution. I would perhaps summarize that evolution in 4 dimensions. The first one, and perhaps the most important, a shift from a top-down, externally driven approach to a bottom-up, country-driven approach, including the development of South-South cooperation. The second dimension of evolution would be the expansion in the country range. So moving from a focus on large emerging economies, which was the case in the first generation of JETPs, to become a much more inclusive approach, considering country platforms for smaller, low-income countries and SIDS. The third dimension, I would say, would be the broadening of the sectoral and thematic range of country platforms, beyond a focus on the energy transition. So in my view, by definition, if one says a country platform is country-driven, it then needs to have the flexibility to accommodate priorities set by countries, which may include adaptation, nature, forests, or any topic that a country considers to be of transformational importance. And the fourth dimension, I would say, is a much earlier consideration of aspects such as just transition, civil society, local financial institutions, and private sector involvement. So in summary, I would say the evolution of country platforms, recent evolution, should make them much more responsive to address the needs of a broader range of countries and of a broader range of climate and development challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Josué. I mean, those are really remarkable insights, and particularly how the concept has matured and then this broadening of application and approach. So, I mean, you did a really interesting paper earlier this year, which you kindly released at the exchange I was talking about in Cape Town, which was, I think you call it the country platform development model, or the escalator model. I'm going to ask Hayden to just pop a link in the chat so that anyone that wants to follow that model can. But can you tell us in broad outline, I mean, what were you trying to do with that escalator model, and what are the steps that country platforms should go through?
Great question. Actually, the note was indeed developed for the event that you organized. But let's say, I think this can be summarized in 5 stages, which you refer to, and we refer to a bit as the escalator. And as I will run fast through these steps, it's great if the link can be provided, because then anyone interested in the topic can look at it in more detail. So, in summary, stage 1 is about initial engagement. And I would say 4 important points there to be ascertained. A clear goal. A country platform needs to have a clear goal set by the country. Cross-government engagement is a second element. A notion of the investment required, to achieve that goal. And finally, I think it's important, particularly in the context that we have, which is not easy, early identification of potential funding sources. Okay, so these are 4 elements that we include there in terms of setting that initial base, for consideration. Stage 2, we called program readiness. So that is really setting the base for a successful and impactful platform. Melanie actually mentioned some of these elements, in her intervention earlier. So key elements here, probably no surprise to most on the call here, strong institutional structure, technical readiness, including, for example, on transition plans, on the analytics underpinning, the technical work, and policy, as Melanie mentioned. And I think a third element here, very important in these terms of program readiness, is stakeholder engagement. Early on and broad, not only, for example, civil society, but for example, what we noted in the past, practice, this private sector is generally brought much too late, right? Lots of ideas can come from an early engagement. Stage 3 really covers the formulation of the investment program, and that reflects the scale and the sequencing of the projects that are necessary to achieve the platform goal. So here, again, familiar words to all, not so easy to do generally: pipeline development, project preparation, early consideration of just transition, and identifying opportunities where appropriate for private investment. Stage 4 is about financing, right? So that's really that expression, building, the platform capital stack, which in general will cover both public and private, and very important, both local and external finance source. And so this includes access to concessional finance, and the point that Melanie also mentioned about optimization of grant use and the formulation of blended finance instruments to enhance financing terms or to mobilize private finance. And then we get to the final stage, stage 5. I often call it the often forgotten but fundamental step of implementation. So this is not just about disbursements or capacity to absorb funds and implement projects, but it's also about sustaining political alignment and civil society engagement. And it's also about monitoring, evaluating, and reporting to ensure impact, because at the end of the day, that is the reason for doing it. So sorry for rushing through the escalator, but hopefully we managed to respond to your question in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Josue. I mean, I must tell you, those steps, for countries now considering, where they are in the process, how to get on the escalator, it's an incredibly useful step-by-step guide. So I do want to encourage people. It's a short, easy to read document, and it's a really great resource. Thanks, Josue. I'm going to turn to Maria. So for those of you that don't know her, Maria Neto is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Climate and Society in Brazil, which we all commonly refer to as ICS. And she's been integral to many. I mean, she's a close advisor to the Brazilian government, also runs a major re-granting operation in the country, and has been intimately involved in discussions around the Baku to Belém roadmap, the Brazil country platform, which they call the Plan for Ecological Transformation. So, Maria, I wonder if I could start by saying, I mean, it's very encouraging that, the way this Baku to Belém roadmap is evolving, it's envisaging a new cohort of country platforms. And I think that's been a sort of rallying call to all of these developing countries that are thinking about putting platforms together. Can you elaborate a bit on how this roadmap, I mean, I know there are different pillars. How does the roadmap propose to scale up these kinds of financial partnerships? And maybe in particular, if you could comment on some of the early stage funding elements that you think are going to be key to getting success with this roadmap.
Thank you, Crispian. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to talk a bit about the role of country platforms, which indeed is one piece in many different pieces that have been identified by the Brazilian government as important, let's say, bricks for us to get to a roadmap from Baku to Belém. Among the exercises, I think the most important that the government is actually currently preparing is something called the Circle of Finance Ministers, where the Ministry of Finance is collaborating with over 30 ministries of finance. They have identified different priorities. Some of them are very aligned with the G20 priorities, but broadening them up to more countries, including, for instance, the reform of international financial institutions, including, for instance, the need for us to continue with reform with vertical funds or the green climate funds. But one big piece on the conversation is how we can improve domestic mobilization, not necessarily only from the point of view of mobilizing domestic resources, but capacity and ecosystems at the national level to be able to combine domestic with international, public with private resources, concessional with commercial. And also, the discussion is a bit of the experience and the inputs have been that to mobilize this 1.3 trillion, a lot is about how we, of course, leverage private investments, what is the role of public to catalyze private, but it's also about how the countries are ready to have pipelines of projects that are investable, and is also about how the countries are ready to mobilize resources according to their own situations. And I think the country platforms become a very important concept, as Josué was just explaining, because they are an opportunity for countries to get organized in different ways. Some countries may be focusing more on adaptation. Other countries, as the case of Brazil, may look at nature-based solutions and energy. In the case of South Africa, the initial approach was on energy and is moving to adaptation. So every country can look at its own priorities, but mainly be able to do a couple of things. Understand what kind of investments they need so that we know how much we really need and how we can be able to quantify and have a strategy to mobilize. What is the role of our domestic resources to catalyze international resources? How we reduce the cost of funding and access to international finance? And what is the role of concessional to scale private sector? So I think this is the big innovation that is going to be brought in the conversation, which is, as much as we need to talk about different ways to scale with reforms of international financial institutions, with broader understanding of what we need to do in terms of de-risking and prudential mechanisms to scale private sector, we also need to talk about the capacity of the countries to access finance and the capacity of the countries to mobilize finance. And that can be through this kind of platforms. Of course, every country may have, again, a different platform, but there is a lot of opportunities also for countries to learn with each other and have common practices on how they can do this mobilization. Thank you.
Yeah, no, those are profound points, Mulia. And I mean, I think particularly the way we link this to the broader financial architecture reforms that are being discussed, for instance, in the G20 process. One country on its own can't move the needle necessarily, but if we're linking it to broader multilateral processes that are creating the right environment for platforms, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, you guys captivated the world's imagination last year when Brazil launched its plan for ecological transformation. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit. I mean, you were closely involved in that process. And I love the way it links to issues around equitable growth, job creation, the broader resilience agenda in developing countries. Can you just explain a little bit about how that works within the Brazil platform and what its relevance is to other developing countries?
I think it was an interesting case where the global conversation of G20 inspired Brazil to find its own solution, and learning by the G20 experiences of some countries, like the case of South Africa itself. So first, I think the governance is interesting because you have the Ministry of Finance having a leading role, but they brought a number of line ministries to coordinate the platform, including environment, energy, and industry. But also they are mainly operating with the Development Bank of Brazil, which has an important role in terms of pipeline building, but also in terms of financial innovation. And the platform is also collaborating with a number of outside kind of private sector building blocks, including GFunds as a big partner in terms of looking at private sector pipelines, but also some initiatives like the Nature Investment Lab, which is a laboratory in Brazil from private sector asset managers and investors on nature-based solutions, and ITA, which is another platform, is a hub for industry and green hydrogen. So it was interesting because you had like a pyramid where you have the government, but then you have the development bank, working with different initiatives from private sector to identify pipeline of projects. They have already identified over 10 billion of pipeline that works on nature-based industry and energy. So also being very broad in terms of its transformational, ecological transformation platform, as you said, Crispian. So thinking beyond just energy, looking at a broader way of what is important for Brazil in terms of development, regional growth, and of course then climate change and mitigation. No? And further, I think what is interesting is the platform is not just about the pipe and investments, it is having an important role to develop innovative financial instruments. To give some examples on what we did recently on NatureBase, Brazil has a guarantee that is called EcoInvest, which was created to mainly cover risks relating to hedge. This guarantee was developed some time ago and was focusing on infrastructure. But thanks to the dialogue we are having on the country platform and the Nature Investment Lab, a lot of inputs were given by investors, by private sector on how the guarantee could be managed and designed and redesigned to also cover nature-based solutions and agriculture projects. And actually, currently, the guarantee is being modified for that, and we will have 2 different calls still this year, one for agriculture and another for nature-based solution, to reduce the hedge costs and attract international investments for nature-based. And so it's interesting because not only we are developing a pipeline, but this kind of dialogue allowed also to innovate with financial instruments.
Yeah, I mean, you've done some really innovative best practice examples. And I mean, I constantly refer to the way that you brought your national bank, BNDES, into the center of the process of developing this platform, originating the project, structuring the finance, putting the demand and the supply side together. So there's an enormous amount to be learned from the way Brazil is innovating with its platform. So I want to stick on the theme of nature, but change countries. And I'm going to ask Laura Sabogal if you could maybe come into the conversation. So Laura wears many hats. She's a senior policy advisor at E3G. She's working for the Finance and Commons Secretariat, and she's Colombian and has been closely involved in many of the discussions in Colombia, I mean, which culminated, I mean, I think Colombia actually launched the platform last year. There have been a few ups and downs in terms of the political situation. And I must say, you know, it was terrible news to hear about the assassination attempt on your opposition candidate. But let's not get distracted by that. I mean, I think what's very interesting is the way that your country investment plan went beyond the power and energy sectors to include finance for nature and forests. And, you know, these are traditionally very hard areas to bring finance into. So I want to ask you to just reflect on what special considerations need to be given to a platform that encompasses nature.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Crispian, and great to see so many friends. Yes, so I think I will just give a very, very brief intro as to what the Colombian platform is. The Plataforma País para la Acción Climática y la Transición Socioecológica, the name in Spanish. It's a strategic, structural, and cross-sectoral mechanism. It's a whole of government push designed to coordinate, finance, and implement the country's socio-ecological and energy transition. It was initially announced by President Gustavo Petro at COP28 in Dubai. And as you were mentioning, we've had a series of milestones with a formal launch that took place last year. And actually this year in Cape Town during Finance in Common, we were very lucky to have our now Minister of Finance, who in that moment was the president of the conglomerate of national development banks. And he actually had the opportunity to hear firsthand of all of the different examples that Maria and other of the panelists were mentioning, to really foster that exchange that is super necessary between South-to-South countries. So in the context of Colombia, similar like Brazil, as you know, we have a very, very big part of the Amazon following Brazil. And so also in the context of Colombia, having been a country that has suffered a long civil conflict, it's very, very important to create, let's say, a transition that will also answer the needs of communities. And this means also tackling the question of how to harness the biological richness and the wealth that the country has. And I think here I want to make a small remark as to why this is important. Colombia is also a very big fossil fuel producer. It's one of the main exporters of coal in the world, also jointly with South Africa. So for us, and I say as a Colombian, the transition is not only about raising those funds to create or to bring new technologies into the country, but it's really also about filling in that fiscal gap. So in this sense, the country platform of Colombia, which derives from our plan for the socio-ecological transition, looks, as you rightfully said, of course, as a just energy transition and reindustrialization, ecosystem conservation and restoration, sustainable production systems, and the biodiversity economy, and climate change adaptation. And you can see from those topics, at the very least 3 or 4 are related to nature. So in terms of what needs to be done, or the considerations as you were mentioning, it's very, very important to have a territorial focus. What does that mean? Of course, this is coordinated through a governance structure, which involves this interministerial coordination, but it's really, really important to take it to a sub-national level, especially in a country as biodiverse and as geographically rich as Colombia is. Over to you.
Brilliant. No, thank you. So, I mean, there are quite a few complexities involved in your platform. And I mean, the nature side, obviously, so you've explained that. But I mean, the other characteristic of Colombia is that you don't just have one national development bank, you've got multiple banks. I can't remember exactly how many. And I understand that they've come together in some sort of conglomerate formation. And I just wanted to get a sense of how that coordination happens, particularly when you're doing quite complicated things. I mean, Maria was talking earlier about the kinds of de-risking measures that are needed to make platforms succeed. So how's that given effect in the structure that you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's great to have Maria here because actually when we were in Cape Town during Financing Common in the retreat that Crispian, you hosted with other South African colleagues, we had a little discussion. So the now Minister of Finance of Colombia, Germán Ávila, had a little bilateral chat with Ivan Oliveira from the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. And Ivan was precisely sharing how Brazil had put BNDES at the center and how beneficial that had been for the project structuring and everything that Maria was mentioning. In the case of Colombia, we don't have such a big, let's say, monster of a bank as BNDES, which is an incredible institution. We rather have 4 national development banks that now have been brought together under what is called El Grupo Bicentenario, which is the 4th largest or even 3rd largest financial holding group of the country. It's not only composed of these national development banks, but it also has the insurance company, the national insurance companies, as well as the National Guarantee Fund. And the idea behind this was to really harness the different strengths and the different, let's say, pieces of the puzzle that each of these institutions were catering to. Which, again, as you said, it has its, let's say, its pros and its cons. Its pros is that, of course, because all of these different banks have different characteristics. Some are tier 2. That means that they don't lend directly to the end client, but rather to other banks. Some of them are tier 1. That means that they have a business to client, let's say, business model. And because they have different territorial and sectoral focus, that means that in a way, it can have a more comprehensive strategy, perhaps, but the coordination is a little bit more difficult, as you said.
Yeah.
Luckily, the group has now been established. It's adhered to the Ministry of Finance, which is also the coordinator of the country platform. And it has been actually quite a positive thing because, for example, within those banks, I'm going to very briefly mention them. We have Bancoldex, Findeter, Financiera Nacional de Desarrollo, and FDN. They have the focus as I just mentioned. But for example, for infrastructure financing, at FDN, we have the ability of doing project finance. So helping the structuring process, right? Whereas some of the other banks that I just mentioned don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
So then what we can do with this programmatic approach, and once the government has defined its pipeline, which transcends the energy piece and it's rather whole of economy approach, then the different pieces, the different banks can support this process according to their capacities. And the last thing that I would say is very useful is that two of these banks had been in discussions with one of the MDBs for a guarantee. And now what's happening is that these conversations are not happening in an isolated manner, but rather the group is coordinating to kind of have a strategy that answers to the national pipeline of projects, but also leverages, let's say, the different banks to reduce the cost of capital in the operation for the country.
No, that's super interesting. I mean, look, I think we could do a whole seminar just on these mega biodiverse countries and the kinds of special considerations that you've got to do to structure platforms in them. But I want to turn to another category of countries. So, you know, I've seen a couple of questions in the Q&A about less developed contexts. There was a particular question around Bangladesh. And we're very lucky to have Abena with us. So Abena Tachiwa Asamoah Achere, she's the Managing Director and Finance Advisor to the vulnerable group of 20 Ministers of Finance. And they may be called the V20, but I think they're, Abena, more like the V70. You can tell
75.
75. Wow. Okay. But you guys have been doing some very interesting work with your members. I mean, you know, including developing these what you call climate prosperity plans, which is really putting, you know, climate and the economy and development together in a closely knit way. So I want to ask you about these, you know, less developed contexts and the unique finance and climate challenges that your members face. What kind of new or innovative approaches to country platforms need to be developed within the V20 group? And, you know, I'm particularly mindful of like some of the SIDS who've been looking at regional platforms, and I know there's been a lot of talk at the Ocean Summit around this. So it'd be good to hear from you on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Crispin. Just to quickly make a correction, you were initially going to get Sarah Ahmed, who is actually a Managing Director and V20 Finance Advisor, but I'm actually the Director for country platforms, no worries.
Okay, so you're the expert on country platforms in the V20.
I try to be.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Crispin. Really, I just wanted to give a little more context to our country. So we're looking at, of course, 75 countries that are significantly climate impacted. And according to the V20 loss report, we're looking at having lost about 20% of our wealth over 20 in 2 decades, totaling up over $525 billion US. We're looking at countries that have significant fiscal constraints. And to sum it up, basically, climate change significantly does undermine economic growth and is significantly damaging critical sectors like agriculture and tourism, increasing financial burdens through disaster-related infrastructure damage and rising debt. But you are absolutely right. You know, the country platform is very critical to the process of developing the climate prosperity plans. And these are investment and financing strategies that we develop with countries to help build climate resilience and climate prosperity. It's important to note that, the climate prosperity plans are important in terms of helping our countries access low cost of capital for climate resilient investments. And, it's also an opportunity to leverage South-South cooperation for green growth and technological transfers. So just to reiterate that, look, the V20 platforms are very elemental to the process. Now, for the V20, the country platforms we don't see them as new structures. We really do believe that most of our countries already have these structures. They may have existed from previous climate and financing coordination efforts, be it with the NAPs, the NDCs, the IMF, RST applications. But what we do with these structures is strengthen them, strengthen the coordination around the finance ministry to ensure that the focus is on investments, goes beyond the strategies to investments and financial strategies that can bring in the private sector. And I don't need to tell anyone what it looks like with, diminishing ODA, and so, I mean, what is clear is that in the 21st century, where you have corporations sometimes having more resources than countries, it does make sense for countries to position themselves to be able to tap into those resources. So yeah, it becomes an issue of nomenclature, but very similar to some of the country platforms that have been described. Laura mentioned that the finance ministry plays a critical role in their country platform. It's same for the CVF V20 country platforms. It's actually the reason why the V20 is the one that houses the concept of the climate prosperity plans and not the environment ministries, because the belief is that the finance ministries are the ones that determine the use of resources in the country, and therefore are in a better position to harness and to mobilize and to coordinate resources, agencies, and people around the priorities and the objectives of the country. So the V20 platforms also leverage partnerships significantly, especially as relates to DFIs and MDBs, to ensure that we can bring in more risk-sharing mechanisms such as first loss capital, credit guarantees, equity co-investment through sovereign wealth funds or national development banks. And especially in this scenario, the expectation is that these co-investments provide not only financing, but also market intelligence, industry contact, and signaling in effect that attracts further private investments. And then also the V20 country platforms do not just focus on government projects. It's very interested in transformational private sector projects that would facilitate climate resilient growth, provide green jobs, and contribute innovative solutions and technology to climate problems. And then to wrap up, I'd like to say that all V20 country platforms are supported by the CVF V20 Secretariat with transaction and financial advisory, macro modeling on debt, carbon markets, early stage capital, and project preparation, as well as regulatory and policy reform.
Yeah, no, that's great, Abena. I mean, you've basically answered the second question I was going to pose to you. So I'm running out of time, so I'm actually not going to repeat that question, but I will come back to you in the closing and we can pick up some of the other points that were raised. So if I can bring in Olympus then. So I'm turning to my home country. Olympus is the head of climate and environmental finance at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Olympus was one of the key movers. We were hosting the FIC Summit in Cape Town. DBSA was the public development bank on the spot. So well done, Olympus, for pulling that off. But I wanted to, I mean, you've heard a lot about the role of national banks in this conversation. And you've had very, particular experiences in the South African context, involved in various aspects of the JETP, just transition financing. So it would be good to get some reflections from you on how you see national banks, not just here in South Africa, but broadly across the developing world, how national banks can play a role in making these platforms happen.
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for the invitation. I think it is quite clear that national development banks are critical with regard to deployment of the objectives of country platforms, especially in as far as mobilizing the right capital is concerned. And I think we are all starting from an understanding that public resources in themselves are limited in comparison to what we seek to achieve. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense to be using the limited resources in an innovative manner, and maybe more specifically to see how you crowd in private investment at scale. And I think that talks to developing and designing innovative instruments that accomplishes exactly that, which is crowding in private investment. But to do that, you really need a good understanding of the financing needs throughout the various stages of project development, from concept right through to bankability. And then you need to understand the different players along that value chain. And then with that, you are not going to find one institution that covers the rest of the value chain. Therefore, partnerships are quite key. And for us, I just wanted to give an example of a facility that we put in place to support embedded generation in the country, which covered both public and private sector. We found it a little easier to support private sector, but public space was a bit of a challenge. Most of the projects we found would be sitting at concept stage, which meant that they could not even benefit from our support from project preparation, where we require the entry point to be feasibility stage. So through partnership with the likes of UK Pact, we had them come in to support municipalities at concept stage, right to the entry point of our project preparation. And therefore, we can then take it from there to bankability and then support them through the embedded generation program. So it's quite important to be looking at this from a partnership point of view. The second point that I think national development banks play in general, like the DBSA, would be access to your vertical funds such as your GCF, GEF. We have found that quite useful, especially in driving country priorities in alignment with the objectives of country platforms. And important in that, ensuring that you pass on the concessionality from these resources to support the beneficiaries in this project development. And the other thing has really been how you start integrating biodiversity, nature-based solution into infrastructure, development. And for us at the DBSA, it really starts at the planning stage, because we play a lot in that space, assisting municipalities in putting together plans that translate into infrastructure programs. And therefore, ensuring that you start to really inculcate this at the early stage is quite key to ensure that the resultant infrastructure programs already have this embedded in them. And that also is important in allowing you to then be able to access the right financial resources. I was tempted to give an example, but I think time might not allow me. Maybe I'll catch it.
I have to say I've mismanaged time slightly. So I'm going to turn to our next speaker. I'm going to come back to you, Olympus, with one or two other questions from the Q&A. But I really appreciate the way you've sketched out the full project cycle that you're involved in, from planning through project origination, preparation, also on the supply side, financial mobilization, structuring the finance, putting it together with the projects. This is precisely the sort of anchoring role that development banks can be playing in these platforms. So I want to introduce our last panelist to you, but by no means least. And I only got to know her recently. I was visiting Rwanda, which was an absolute pleasure, and got a chance to meet Teddy Mugabo, who is the dynamic Chief Executive Officer of the Rwanda Green Fund. And, I was really struck. Rwanda's been developing these integrated investment plans for various initiatives. They've put a big priority on sustainable land management. There's an investment plan nearly ready on that. They're working on green cities, climate smart agriculture. I think there's one on renewables in the pipeline. And the Rwanda Green Fund is a fairly recent institution. It's sort of been set up to be at the center of implementing these investment plans. So I wonder, Teddy, if you could just talk a little bit about the role you play in this project life cycle that Olympus was describing. So, development, financial mobilization, how you put the funds together.
Thank you, Crispian, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this really, really interesting conversation around platform financing. It's great to see very many familiar faces. Maria, I believe Olympus, we've been on a panel before, so really, really, really happy to be here. So I think to begin with, I actually want to it's really interesting as these platforms were being developed. I actually came to realize that the Rwanda Green Fund is the country's platform, if I can call it. It was really established to act as a financing vehicle that would play a role in mobilizing climate finance needed to support the country's very ambitious green growth strategy. So I think in the simplest form, based off how everybody talked about the different, nationally owned thinking, programmatic investment planning. That's pretty much why the Rwanda Green Fund was established. So just to give a very quick overview, it all starts with, at least for us, it starts with very the political will, but also the government really emphasizing the need for the country to develop in a climate compatible manner. So we started off back in 2009, developing very rigorous strategies, green growth and climate resilience strategies that were looking at all the different priority sectors. And then also really starting to think, how do we develop in a climate compatible development? How do we, climate change should not always be considered as, that standalone or mainstreaming. It's rather, how do we bring the two together, sustainability and development? And therefore, there was also that quick realization that, well, it's one thing to have great strategies and policies, but there's always the question of financing, and considering that we're a developing country, there's different pressing needs. And therefore, that's why the Rwanda Green Fund was established, to really play that role of resource mobilization. So we've been in place since 2012, and we've been able to mobilize. So our resource mobilization strategy really involves aggressively working, looking for like-minded partners, but also working with both development partners through bilateral, multilateral. We've also recently started, we have a partnership with the Gates Foundation. So really looking at all the different pools we can pull together into this basket fund, and then we're able we're able to deploy the funding both to public sector projects, but also playing a de-risking role for the private sector. Just quickly coming to the question you mentioned, I'll try to be fast. So we've been in place for the last 13 years, a little bit over a decade. But what we came to realize about 3 years ago was that, climate finance, and this was highlighted already, it's fragmented. There's a lot of, small pieces, and even the fund, the way we were actually investing, we were providing grant financing to small projects, but in a fragmented manner. And therefore, we did an impact evaluation, after 10 years, and we said, we really do need to change the approach and shift from project-based to programmatic. And that's how we also realized that we have to work with key ministries. So we started working closely with the Ministry of Finance, but also to understand, because they're also in charge of the economic planning, but also looking at what are some of the sectors that are highly vulnerable to climate change in our context. 80% of our population relies on agriculture. So we almost had to work backwards and say, before we go out there to look for climate finance, let's first start off by understanding the needs, the national priorities, and also prioritizing, because you're never gonna have sufficient funding for everything. So now we've come up with 3 investment plans. I would even call them frameworks, because Rwanda is extremely hilly, so we're highly vulnerable to, like landslides, which then affects the farmers. So we've now developed a sustainable land management framework. We are working on one on climate smart agriculture. So now through by developing these investment frameworks, then the next step is to develop investment plans and pipeline development. So that's, and what this exercise, although it's still ongoing, but what it has done that I'm really appreciating is the fact that the complementarity. And again, the platform, because if we really want to see transformative change, but if we also want to use limited and scarce financing, especially on the public sector side, we do need to come together. We do need to. So this process has really, facilitated us to work with ministries, with NGOs, understanding the landscape, what are the donors interested in, and it's almost basically saying that we're eventually gonna use the resources to avoid the fragmentation and really complement each other and be able to drive transformative change. Then last is the innovative financial instruments. We also are always actively looking at ways in which we can unlock private sector. So I'm going to answer the second question because I don't think we have time. We also know that public sector financing is not going to address everything. So at the fund, we launched an investment. It's called Direme Invest. It's another small platform within the big platform of the Green Fund that focuses on private sector. And this is a partnership with our Development Bank of Rwanda. So very similar to what Olympus was talking about. It's basically a facility that provides financial products to businesses across the business life cycle. So we're offering grants to the ideation and incubation phase, the recoverable grants. We're looking at providing equity financing, loans, guarantees, but really supporting businesses alongside the way. So I'll stop there. And thank you very much again for the opportunity.
No, Teddy, you're an inspiration to many of us, and it was absolutely great to meet you. And I agree. I mean, what you're doing is a platform, and it would be great to collaborate around taking it further to scale. So, colleagues, we've now heard from all of our panelists, and I really want to thank you. That was an incredibly rich set of inputs. And while you've been speaking, the audience has been posing some really interesting questions in the Q&A, which I'm going to try and summarize. So, I mean, I've given a scan through those questions. I see some of you were typing replies, so thank you for that. So there are a couple of questions about how platforms link with NDCs, with NAPs, with national plans. And I'd like one of you to pick that up. There are 3 or 4 questions about the role of subnational government. So a lot of people are asking, are these just national platforms? How do cities get involved in them? How do regions and states get involved? And I guess you could even be more decentralized. How do communities on the ground actually get involved? So a strong theme around subnational, and it'd be good to get some reflections from some of you on that. Then there was a very pointed question around the role of developed countries. So, we've been talking a lot about the demand side and how developing countries are putting platforms together. What do we need from developed countries to enable these platforms to happen? It would be great to get a response on that. Then 2 questions around private finance. So how do we attract and de-risk private finance at scale? And what sort of examples are there? Like, first loss facilities and blended finance facilities, etc. Then, Abena, I heard a question around, are there success stories from the Caribbean? I think there definitely are. You've got a number of members there. I don't know if you want to pick that up. And then some governance issues. So people asking, are there good examples where platforms have included civil society and other stakeholders from the get-go? What about transparency and accountability? Are these being built into platforms? Someone asked about the science policy interface, which is also integral to the success of platforms. So I'm going to just put your hand up or wave at me if you want to pitch in and reply. Josue.
Yeah, just to get things going. So maybe I'll take the two of the questions. One on the link to NDCs, etc. That's a very important question in the sense that I would say 2 comments there. One is really to make the distinction that a country platform, as was mentioned right at the beginning, is an instrument to be able to implement a specific goal from that a country has. Okay. I think then the point to be made is the scope and the number, the range of issues that is addressed needs to a certain extent to be commensurate with the capacity, to undertake, and follow. So that is why perhaps a country like Brazil can identify 3 particular objectives and then follow them side by side. I would say countries perhaps with a weaker local capacity at the start, probably better, to start with a specific objective, see how it works, and then build on, from there. And the important point is therefore that, country platforms cannot be seen as an instrument that can implement a whole NDC, for example, because that really, I think Teddy made the point, in terms of actually programmatically already trying, because each of these is a different issue, different partners, different finance solutions. So we need to be careful there. Second, quick on subnational. That's a big question. And I would say it probably ought to be looked at in 2 different ways. One is that in the implementation and the development of any platform, and this goes very much with that line about early engagement, it's very important to see to which extent, subnational, cities, are consulted, in the development of a particular program, for example. So that, I would say, is part of the process. The second way you could have is to say, okay, you take, for example, an issue that's, rising everywhere, which is, for example, the urban adaptation challenge, right? How are cities dealing with flooding, with extreme heat and all that? And if a government decides that that is a priority for them, you could imagine, in a way, the formulation of a specific, investment program oriented to that, okay? But I mentioned these 2 because, again, one is really mainstreaming in the process, cities and subnational, whatever the topic, right? And the other one is really having a country platform that is focused, on urban issues. Thank you.
No, thanks, Josue. That's very helpful. I'm going to go Olympus, Maria, Laura, Teddy. And then
thank you very much.
You can have the last word.
Thank you very much, Crispin. I also wanted to respond to the question around the subnational space. Jesuit has already taken some of the points I wanted to mention. So I would talk a lot more to capacity issues, which are quite critical in the subnational space if we are to make movement. I'm sure we'd all agree that the subnational space tends to be ground zero where implementation is concerned. Just talking to some of the initiatives that we have seen quite useful is, taking along a number of municipalities in country in programs that we are running where there is encouragement of peer-to-peer learning on an international basis, learning from various experiences and picking up from there and building up the expertise within municipalities is quite key, because it goes beyond just mobilizing climate finance, but building the capacity to then deploy financing. The other role from our end has been really in giving effect to the Climate Change Act, where the requirements for municipality to start building vulnerability frameworks. We have to date, at least in country, worked with 47 municipalities where these frameworks has been put in place. But again, they are not just sitting there in some file 17, they translate into the plans that we then develop with municipalities, again, to give effect to the objectives, of the Act. So I think it's quite key to really keep hammering on the capacity side of things where the subnational space is concerned to make sure that we accelerate deployment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Olympus. Maria?
I wanted to take up on the governance and the participation in terms of private sector and de-risking mechanisms. I think what was interesting in the case of Brazil, I mentioned the Eco-Invest, but I think, when we talk about scaling de-risking mechanisms, there is no one bullet like solution. Different kinds of challenges and investments need different types of de-risking mechanisms. And I think the beauty of this governance in Brazil to not only rely on the government priorities and the development bank, but also building these private sector hubs, like, as I mentioned, the Nature Investment Lab, the innovation and transition for industry, is that we can come up also with proposals of what are the challenges. So, for example, nature-based solutions, a lot of the challenges are relating to, for instance, restoration. A forest may take 4 or 5 years to grow up. So you have risks that are long paybacks, risk relating to not knowing what is going to be the actual off-taking, and not really financial instruments that are available in the market today to deal with some of those opportunities. So by looking at that in this way, we can better understand where do we need concessional finance, for instance, to maybe pilot insurance for the first years of the tree growing, and or for example, for performance guarantees that could allow then the private banks and the development bank to finance further. Because the experience so far in Brazil for restoration is that there is a lot of finance, but the guarantees don't exist, and without the collateral, the investors don't want to move. No? So to give this kind of very specific examples, I think the interesting on the platforms is to have these conversations, but then use the platform to present the larger pipeline and the solution building, bringing, let's say, philanthropies, concessional finance, like in the case of Brazil, the Green Climate Fund is supporting the platform itself in also identifying precisely in the platform where are the kinds of investments that would need the climate finance support. And then from there to see what is the potential to leverage private sector and public sector. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Very helpful. Laura?
Yes. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the point of governance and also how that influences private capital mobilization. So one of the things that, for example, has been quite useful in terms of tackling this at a more programmatic, in a more programmatic way, but also through facilitating the delivery architecture that allows for the uptake of lessons learned, but also for those first movers, for example, the BSA that has gone through this process, as Olympus was walking us through, for countries that are now starting, one of the things that Finance in Common / IDFC International Development Finance Club is doing jointly with MIGA is exploring a guarantee platform that can then be integrated or deployed in the context of national development banks of countries that are starting this process. Another thing that I think is quite positive in this regard is that for those countries that, for example, don't have access to capital markets and that would have a difficulty because there is, of course, some challenges in terms of the deploying these guarantees, then another option is to through regional development banks, for example, the West African Development Bank, BOAD. And this is why I think it's also really important, following the example of Brazil and Colombia, for those countries that are in the process of thinking through that governance structure to really consider how their national development bank ecosystem can help the mobilization of those resources and can articulate their efforts with external financiers, whether those are other multilateral banks or also maybe other sources such as philanthropies.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Teddy, I mean, you've been doing this with the IREME Invest, so
Yeah.
you've got the practical experience on how this works.
Yeah, thank you. So before I talk about IREME, I wanted to touch on, there was a question on the subnationals. I wanted to touch on that very quickly. And then and transparency, accountability, and then IREME. I think Maria talked on the private sector as well, how to de-risk. But I think that the beauty about the programmatic approach is that it allows for different stakeholders to come together. And so just to give you an example, with the Rwanda Green Fund, we play the role of resource mobilization, but after having worked out an investment plan with ministries, districts, local community, bringing in the local communities, and then when the financing is mobilized, it's channeled to it could be to a ministry, it could be to an NGO, it could be to a local government authority. So just wanted to really emphasize that that's what's really good about this programmatic approach, is that we all come together to plan and understand the needs. And then, whoever is responsible for bringing the resources goes out there to look for it. And when it comes, it's then channeled to the implementer. So then we're also able to assess who's good at what. There are certain activities that are going to be done better than NGOs. There are others that could be through a community approach, but we also want to always encourage private sector. How do these communities form cooperatives so that we can have sustainability? And then there was a question around transparency, accountability of platforms. This is very, very important. And just again, to share, our experience with the fund. So now I'm going to start calling the Rwanda Green Fund the country's platform. So we built strong fiduciary systems. We have an independent, we have autonomy in terms of how we invest. We have an independent board of directors, which is always also very good when we engage several partners. And then also MRV, obviously monitoring, reporting, and verification. So these are things that, country platforms do need. If we really want this to be the way to mobilize, we do need to think about these three things. Now, there's a question on developed countries. What do we need from developed countries? I think when we say what we need from developed countries, I'm also going to sort of talk about the development partners. I think really just basic ask is they need to believe in country platforms. Because we oftentimes talk about, this is what we're doing. And I think Josue talked about it. There are certain, countries will have priorities based on their needs. But unfortunately, we still see this happening whereby when you're mobilizing, financial resources, it comes with so many conditions that are not really taking into account the needs and the context. So you find yourselves in, consistent procurement, no objection. And, so for me, I think from the experience we've had over the last decade is, if we really believe that country platforms are the way to go, we also from the developed side of the world, they do need to believe in the country platforms, because then otherwise, I think that's why we really see that it's the slowness, but also that we waste so much time in different objections and conditions that are not really reflecting the country needs. I mean, I don't know if you want, well, IREME Invest, it's really what we've done with IREME Invest is that we as the Rwanda Green Fund continue playing a role of mobilizing grant financing, which we then use. We were able to get the development banks on board, and we've started doing blending, because I think it's also important to understand that at the end of the day, the banks will need some level of sort of bank. They want projects that are bankable. So what we're pioneering, at least because it's only been 1 year since the Ireme Invest has been operational, but really our role is to continue providing the grants and de-risking so that we can, create a pipeline that can then be able to access, the loans. Last but not least is technical assistance. I think, again, we want the subnationals. I think my colleague Olympus talked about it. We are also actively providing technical assistance to especially the local communities, but also the districts, the local government, to even be able to put together a project. So I think we also can't just, sort of wait for projects to come to us. We also need to play a role in pipeline development and origination of projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Teddy. Last but not least, Abene, you've got the final word.
Yeah, thanks. Addressing the question on successes in the Caribbean, just wanted to highlight that, given that this is country-driven, the platforms, we have 6 countries in the Caribbean, but only 2 have requested to develop a CPP, and it's the country platforms according to the CPP. So we have Haiti and Barbados, and as indicated earlier on, the country platforms help with the development of the strategy as well as the implementation. And Haiti's country platform has been phenomenal, especially given their current challenges in terms of help working, the CVF Secretariat working with them to develop the strategy. In fact, it was just very recently, last week, I believe, held the very first consultative engagement with development partners for input into the strategy. And so we're looking forward to seeing how the Haitian country platform would successfully implement the strategy. And then, of course, we also have for the development of the Barbados strategy. But at the moment, I believe we all know that Barbados is also leading the initiative for a regional country platform, which we're all looking forward to seeing how it eventually plays out. So that's basically what we have going on in the Caribbean at the moment.
Thank you for that. So, colleagues, that unfortunately brings us to the end of this really dynamic and exciting session. And I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart all our panelists. I mean, this was an absolute power presentation, and it was great to get into the nitty-gritty of the different experiences that you bring to the table. And we're seeing how this platform concept evolves and deepens, and we're getting into a whole lot of really complicated issues around debt management, nature, how we extend it into adaptation, how we apply it in less developed contexts, etc. And I guess my takeaway is we shouldn't get hung up about the words. So many of you are doing platforms, you just don't call it a platform. And I do want to thank Melanie and Joshua at the beginning, setting out a very clear definition. So, these are country-driven, programmatic interventions backed by an integrated financing strategy. And, it can take many shapes and forms as we move forward. In addition to thanking our panelists, I want to thank the audience. You've been fantastic and great questions. I really want to thank the translators. You've been keeping us on our toes and running. I hope it wasn't too fast for you to translate our words. Emily Vale has been behind the scenes running the Zoom platform, so thank you, Emily. Hayden's been the guy holding all the comms and outreach together and the organization of this. And I've popped his email into the chat. So this is the start of a series of webinars. We want to slowly, over the course of this year, unpack this concept as we go forward. So I'm asking you for your ideas about future webinars. What issues would you like us to delve into? And we will structure a program around that. So just make copy Hayden's email address, which is in the chat, and please send him a note on one or more topics that you'd like us to cover in future, and we will put the program together. So on that note, thank you, everyone. I think we all deserve a round of applause.
Thank you, Crispian. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. Goodbye.